The words that came crashing across the polished mahogany table were cold and deliberate. Either put your name on this resignation letter right now, or we will dismiss you for cause this very moment. After pouring more than 2 decades of everything I had into that company, they handed me less than 60 minutes to dismantle my own professional life. I chose to step down, but on my own terms, using a single carefully engineered sentence that I had prepared in advance. What followed shook them to their core. 5 days after I submitted that letter, their head corporate attorney was dialing my personal number before sunrise, his voice betraying every ounce of the panic running through him. He was desperate to renegotiate the precise language of my departure document. When I quietly walked him through the binding legal reality of what his own executives had already signed and accepted, the room on the other end of that call went absolutely still. It had finally hit them. They had walked straight into a catastrophic trap of their own making, one that threatened to unravel their entire restructuring strategy from the inside out. My name is Julia Vance, and at 46 years old, I had every reason to believe my professional legacy was untouchable. For 21 years, I served as Senior Director of Global Logistics at Vanguard Shipping, a sprawling enterprise supply chain corporation with operations stretching across multiple continents. I had climbed every single rung of that ladder, starting out as a low-wage operations assistant and building my way up to commanding a multi-million-dollar division. I was not merely an employee. I was the breathing institutional memory that held the entire operation together and kept it moving forward. The disruption arrived when Vanguard was absorbed by Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm with a ruthless and well-documented corporate playbook. The strategy was clean and simple on paper. Eliminate every seasoned, higher-earning employee, and bring in fresh graduates willing to work for a fraction of the cost. I watched that machine tear through entire departments in a matter of weeks. Sensing what was coming, I began quietly archiving every contract, internal communication, and critical memo onto encrypted external drives during late evenings when the office had emptied. I had no intention of leaving empty-handed or vulnerable. By midsummer, the new leadership launched their offensive. The brash young chief operating officer, Brody Vance, no family connection to me despite sharing the name, arranged a sudden meeting and announced my salary was being slashed in half under the banner of restructuring. It was a textbook constructive dismissal maneuver, engineered to push me into quitting. Rather than showing any sign of distress, I smiled warmly, declined the demotion without hesitation, and immediately secured representation from a formidable employment attorney named Sarah Jenkins. The final move came on a gray, wet afternoon when Human Resources called me into a sealed conference room. Brody was already seated, flanked by the company's legal team, with a pre-drafted resignation letter positioned directly in front of me. The offer on the table was 3 meager weeks of severance in exchange for signing away every right I possessed. Refuse, and they would terminate me without a single dollar of compensation. They had clearly calculated that a middle-aged woman facing that kind of pressure would simply fold. Drawing on something my father had told me years ago, that no suit in any boardroom would ever bully me into submission, I agreed to resign. But I made one firm demand. I would be submitting my own letter. Brody allowed it with a dismissive smirk and a tight deadline attached. I returned to my desk, pulled up the document Sarah and I had spent weeks refining, and printed it out. That letter contained one precisely worded sentence stating that my resignation was conditional, binding only upon the complete fulfillment of every compensation obligation, benefit entitlement, and stock option contractually owed to me. Because the executives were too eager to mark the moment as a win, they processed and signed the letter without pausing to examine what it actually committed them to. In their rush to celebrate, they had activated a legal mechanism they never saw coming. The phone conversation with their panicked general counsel a few days later was a study in corporate consequence. I walked him through a color-coded spreadsheet detailing every item I was owed, calmly and methodically. Because they had not technically terminated me, I remained a legally active employee, continuing to accumulate salary by the day. Beyond that, my original employment contract included explicit provisions stating that any change of corporate ownership or forced departure would trigger the immediate vesting of my full stock options and a mandatory 20-month continuation of salary. When the numbers were tallied, Meridian Holdings owed me just over $1.7 million. Their counsel attempted to raise the threat of litigation. I responded by calmly reminding him that my encrypted archive contained extensive evidence of age discrimination and systematic wage theft. I held recorded meetings and internal messages in which Brody had openly referred to senior staff members as obsolete relics that needed to be removed from the organization. A public legal proceeding would expose every layer of that misconduct. Meridian understood immediately what that meant for their restructuring plans, their reputation, and their investors. The arrogance that had defined every previous interaction evaporated instantly. What replaced it was urgency, and a desperate desire to make the situation disappear quietly and quickly. They made several attempts to bring the figure down. I held firm each time, reminding them that my daily rate as a still active employee continued adding to the total the longer they delayed. Within a month, the full amount cleared into my account, including every dollar of legal costs I had incurred. I also received a formally worded letter of recommendation bearing the signatures of the very executives who had orchestrated my exit. I stepped away entirely on my own terms, financially independent, while they were left to repair the damage themselves. The final piece of satisfaction arrived about a year later when Brody was let go. After Vanguard hemorrhaged its most valuable client relationships due to operational deterioration he had overseen. What this experience cemented in me is something I now share with anyone who will listen. Your knowledge, your experience, and your loyalty carry enormous value that no corporation has the right to simply erase without consequence. Never allow fear to override your awareness of what you are actually owed. Document every conversation, preserve every relevant communication, and learn your contract as thoroughly as you know your own name. Word of what had happened spread quietly through my professional network. Within a few months, 6 former colleagues from Vanguard contacted me. Each of them was going through a version of the same ordeal I had survived, feeling defeated and unsure of how to respond. I connected every one of them with Sarah Jenkins without hesitation. Watching 3 of those colleagues walk away with substantial 6-figure outcomes meant more to me in that moment than anything sitting in my own bank account. At 47, I operate in a state of deliberate semi-retirement, accepting only the consulting work that genuinely interests me and charging a premium rate that reflects my actual market value. But the work that gives me the deepest sense of purpose now is helping long-tenured professionals build their own defensive strategies before they ever need to use them. I show them how to systematically record corporate misconduct, how to decode the fine print buried in human resources paperwork, and how to transform institutional greed into personal legal leverage. Corporate systems are built on the assumption that experienced workers will be too frightened, too drained, and too silent to push back. They depend on that silence to protect their margins. What they consistently fail to account for is the depth of institutional knowledge those workers carry, the client trust they have cultivated, and the contractual rights they have accumulated over years of service. None of that disappears simply because someone in a corner office decides it is inconvenient. Real power does not live in a corner office or an expensive suit. It lives with the person who understands their own worth, preserves the evidence of their contributions, and refuses to be rushed into surrendering what they have rightfully earned. When a company attempts to force you out through pressure or manipulation, you do not have to comply on their terms. Sometimes the most complete form of justice is not a confrontation. It is leaving with every single thing you are legally owed and letting their own decision-making bring the consequences they deserve. Looking back at that rainy afternoon in the conference room, I understand now that they were not just underestimating the terms of my contract. They were underestimating the kind of person who had spent 21 years learning exactly how that company operated. They expected someone who would pack quietly, leave in silence, and spend the following months questioning her own worth. Instead, I used their own impatience and overconfidence as the instrument of my freedom. The wire transfer that landed in my account was not just money. It was proof that 2 decades of real work cannot be dismissed with a piece of paper slid across a table by someone who barely knew what was in it. The deepest lesson I carry from all of this is that the most powerful tool these organizations use against us is not their legal teams or their financial resources. It is the manufactured belief that we have no power and no options. The moment you replace that fear with careful preparation and an honest understanding of what you are worth, the entire dynamic inverts. So if you ever find yourself sitting across from executives delivering ultimatums with practiced confidence, think of this story, slow down, read every word in front of you. Understand your contract before that moment ever arrives. And never walk away from what you genuinely earned just because someone in authority told you it was time to go.